Hello, my name is Michael Levy. I'm a co-director of the PASS course. The video you're about to watch is an excerpt from a course we developed specifically for Indian and other international CAs who will be writing the CFE in order to obtain their Canadian CPA. The course contains two components. One component is technical instruction. The other component is case writing instruction. This is an exam that is based purely on cases. So in addition to learning your technical, it is absolutely vital to get a good grounding in case writing. The excerpt you're about to watch will give you a good taste for what a CFE case looks like and involves, and it'll also give you an idea of how PASS effectively teaches Indian CAs to write a CFE case successfully. I hope you enjoy this video.
I'd like to welcome everybody to the take-up of KBBT. Let me begin by explaining how I plan to do the take-up. We're going to start by determining what the requireds are and what needs to be done for each required. Once we understand what needs to be done for each required, we'll talk about ranking and time allocation. How much time should I allocate to each required? We'll also talk about integration. By integration, I mean asking yourselves how the requireds are intertwined. As you all know, it's very important to consider integration before you start typing up your case, because depending on how the requireds are intertwined, that will determine the order in which I attack the requireds. We'll then discuss in detail how to address each of the requireds. This was a very quantitative case, so we'll also focus quite a bit on how to approach the quants adequately. There's always a big challenge when you're dealing with a very quantitative case in terms of getting the quants done within the time constraints. We'll deal with that. And then the final thing we're going to do, which I think you'll find extremely, extremely helpful, is the following. For this particular take-up, what I did was the following. I wanted you to get an idea of how a CFE marker looks at a case. So what I did was I asked one of my very experienced CFE markers to actually write up the various issues, both the quantitative and the qualitative. So I asked her to basically come up with a sample student response, both at the RC level as well as at the C level, both the reaching competence level and the competence level. And that way you can see from a CFE marker's perspective how they see the difference between an RC candidate and a competent candidate. I also asked my CFE marker to mark up the sample response with her comments. So you'll definitely be able to get a really, really good understanding of why a CFE marker would consider one paper to be RC and the other to be competent. And that'll enable you to ensure that you can go from RC to competent. Obviously, your goal is to score competent. So if you can understand the difference between the two and why one paper is RC while another is competent, that sort of insight is invaluable to you when you're aiming to get competent yourselves. So we are going to spend a lot of time on the CFE markers sample responses as we go through the issues. So let's start now by pulling out the issues. The first issue comes up in this paragraph right here. I'm proud that my business has been very profitable. You can see from the income statement, and they refer to the statement, they refer to the relevant appendices. I would like you to assess what my business is worth so I know where I stand. So the first required is to determine what the business is worth. Let's move on to the next required. I'm considering a new product for my shop. I drafted my ideas and some preliminary costs. Which one of the two products would be the more profitable option? I'm interested in profitability, not only in the first year, but also on an ongoing basis. So the second required is to determine the profitability of the two product options. And notice how you're asked specifically about the first year versus on an ongoing basis. As we'll see when we take up this required, that was a very important trigger. Please also discuss any qualitative factors I need to consider. So the bottom line is not only do you need to look at profitability, but another sub-required as part of number 2 is your qualitative analysis. So it'll be very important that you do both. The next paragraph brings up another required Based on the analysis and the information you gathered, provide me with a summary on KBBT's strengths and weaknesses, as well as the opportunities and threats from its external environment. So the third requirement is basically to do a SWOT analysis, fairly common way of testing strategy and governance. Also, please address any control weaknesses in KBBT and tell me what changes are required to make my business even more successful. And then he goes on to say, I would appreciate it if your recommendations could incorporate information technology to automate and optimize the processes. So notice that number one, you need to deal with control weaknesses, and you need to tell the owner what changes he needs to make the business more successful. So as is the case, whenever you're dealing with internal controls, you've obviously got to make recommendations for improvement. But there's also another sub-required built in here that you don't always see. And that is that you're being asked specifically when you make your recommendations to incorporate technology to automate and optimize processes. So it'll be very important to take that into consideration when you make your recommendations. Right now, I'm not planning to have an audit done, but I may need one in the future. I'm interested in knowing what substantive procedures can be done to the three revenue accounts, salary and wages, and sponsorship. So you're being asked specifically to do substantive procedures, and they tell you specifically on which accounts to do it: revenues, salaries and wages, and sponsorship. So obviously you don't want to cover any other areas. You want to just deal with the areas you're being asked to deal with. Please assume that all internal control weaknesses will have been addressed based on your recommendations. So that's an important point to pick up on. They're saying very explicitly that whatever recommendations you made in required number 4, assume they've been implemented by the time you come in to do your substantive procedures. Very important to pay attention to that. The last required only comes up in Appendix 5. As we know, either all or most of the requireds are generally going to be in the main body of the question, but there can be an additional required or two in the appendices. In this case, there was a tax required in the final appendix. Let's take a look. We're told, I have some questions about tax. One of the students recently told me about something called exempt supplies. If my bubble tea is part of this, and perhaps we can stop charging HST, how would CRA respond if we stop charging and remitting HST? Are exempt supplies different from taxable supplies and zero rated supplies? Also, can you explain what an input tax credit is? I'm also not sure how often I need to file my HST. So there's a whole bunch of little nitty gritty HST issues that you're being asked to deal with here. And then finally, furthermore, by when do I have to file my 2024 tax returns and pay my taxes? Did I miss the deadline to file and pay? What would be the consequences if I did? So there's also a second sub-required for tax, and that's to deal with basic compliance issues around filing a corporate return. So there were some compliance issues around HST and then further compliance issues around filing a corporate return. So at the end of the day, as you can see, there were a lot of requireds here. We had 6 requireds here. Is this at all unusual? The answer is no. It's not atypical at all on a day 3 case, particularly a 90-minute day 3 case, which is the longest day 3 case you see, to have many, many requireds. So 6 requireds, not at all unusual. Now, the next thing I'd like to do is deal with the ranking and time allocation. Before we take a look at the ranking and time allocation, let's take a look at how much time we would have available to actually type up the case by the time we finish reading and planning. I'm assuming that an average student typically needs about a quarter of the time on most cases to read and plan. By read and plan, I mean read the case and do the outline, leaving over approximately 3/4 of the time to actually type up the case. So on a case like this, by the time you get to the CP, by the time you're really ready to write the exam, you should be able to read a case like this in somewhere between about 20 to 25 minutes, leaving over 65 to 70 minutes to actually write up the case. Initially, it's going to take you a lot longer to read than 20 to 25 minutes, but once you're really up to speed and ready to write, you should be able to read the case in about 20 to 25 minutes, leaving over around 65 to 70 minutes to write up the case. And what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about how would I determine how to allocate that 65 to 70 minutes between the 6 requireds that you see in front of you. For required number one, we're being asked to determine what the business is worth, which involves doing a business valuation. So we know we're dealing with a primarily quantitative required. How else would you decide the worth of the company other than through evaluation? There's lots of numerical information provided over a 3-year period. So you know the valuation will need to consider 3 years of earning. Given that you've got a major quant to do, lots and lots of numbers thrown at you, at the end of the day, very hard to get this done in less than 15 minutes. Even though I realize you've got 6 requireds, and if you spent 15 minutes in every required, you wouldn't have, that would add up to 75 minutes, right? Which you don't have. But add up to 90 minutes, excuse me, which you don't have. But you typically need a disproportionate amount of time for the quants. I believe we talked about this during case writing techniques. When you have a major quant, you're always going to be allocating a disproportionate amount of time. Obviously, you can't afford to allocate 50 minutes to each required when you only have 65 to 70 minutes. But quants, by their nature, require a disproportionate amount of time. For required number 2, there were 2 parts to the required, right? This the required. I've copied out the required up here. There were 2 parts to the required. There was a quantitative and a qualitative element. So the quantitative element was to determine the profitability of the 2 product options. The quantitative element will be time consuming because you've got lots of information given to you in appendix number 4. And you need to consider 2 options, right? The stainless steel straws and the bubble tea popsicles. So there's a lot of quantitative work required for the quants. And then you were told to do a qualitative analysis. The qualitative elements should be quite a bit quicker. You don't need as much time for the qualitative as the quantitative. But by the same token, you don't want to just leave yourself 2 minutes for the qualitative or you won't do justice to it. So you certainly can spend less time on the qualitative, but you'll still need a fairly significant amount of time. So I would have allocated about 15 to 20 minutes for the quants, 5 to 10 minutes for the qualitative. For the third required, the SWOT analysis, as long as you've done a good job of tracking the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats as you were reading through the case, you've either put them on your outline or cross-referenced them from your outline. Writing them up should not take very long because you don't need to write very much for any given strength, weakness, opportunity, or threat. A line or 2 will suffice. So as long as you've tracked them, so you're not wasting a lot of time after you finish reading the case looking for points because you've tracked them well on your outline, as long as that's the case, given that you don't need to spend a lot of time in any given item, and you certainly don't have to hit every last strength, weakness, opportunity, and threat, you can probably get this done easily in 5 to 10 minutes. When it comes to the fourth required, I copied the required right here. There are a number of controls that need to be dealt with. There aren't that many though, so you'll probably want to deal with most of them, though not all of them. How many you should deal with, we'll talk about when we get to it. You don't need to spend a huge amount of time on any given control, but each control will likely take you 2 or 3 minutes to deal with, because remember, for every control, you're going to have to explain the weakness, give the implication, which means explain why it's a weakness, and then make a recommendation. So to do the WIR for each of the issues, and even if you only want to hit, let's say, 4 issues, for example, you'd still need a good 10 minutes. Everybody with me? If you wanted it, let's say 4 or 5 issues, you'd probably need about 10 minutes. For required number 5, you only needed to deal with 3 areas: revenue, salaries, and wages, and sponsorship. You don't have a huge amount of information to work with for any of these areas. So the amount of depth required for the procedures would be less than the depth required for procedures on day 2, for those of you who've chosen assurance as your depth area on day 2. I'd say 5 to 10 minutes for this, probably closer to 5. The last required, guys, was very basic. They were dealing with basic HST compliance and corporate return filing deadlines. As I mentioned earlier, you either know it or you don't. If you know it, you should be able to jot down the points very quickly. There are a whole bunch of little questions, none of which take very long to answer. So if you know the answer, you should be able to answer these questions very quickly. And if you don't, quite frankly, no amount of time is going to help. So as long as you're concise, I would say about 5 to 7 minutes. What I'm going to do now is talk about integration, and then I'm going to take up all of the requireds. The only required I will not take up is number 6, The reason why I'm not going to take up the sixth required is I can't really add any value to number six. There's no case writing skill involved. You either know it or you don't. So if you didn't know it, it's just a question of reading the solution, which you can do on your own. I really wouldn't be adding any value if I took it up. I would really just literally be reading the solution to you. There's really no case writing skill involved for number six. Integration and order of attack. So we said in case writing techniques that it's extremely important to ask yourselves, how are the requirements intertwined? And on that basis, come up with a sequence for answering the requirements. You don't necessarily always answer the requirements in exactly the same order in which they came up in the case. You answer the requirements based on how they're intertwined. If required A impacts B, I do A before B. If B impacts A, I do B before A. So let's take a look, guys. The first example of integration, most people missed. And if you missed it, don't worry. It wasn't critical for getting competent. And the thing that the vast majority of people miss will never be critical for getting competent. In theory, at least, you should have realized that required one, which dealt with the business valuation, and required two, which dealt with deciding which product to choose, stainless steel straws versus bubble tea popsicles, are actually intertwined because any business valuation should be based on future earnings or cash flows, right? And we'll talk later on about what method we would use here. But any business valuation should be based on future earnings. And the future earnings will be impacted by whether we choose option one or option two, whether we choose stainless steel straws or bubble tea popsicles. So in theory, you should have done two before one, decided which option you're choosing, popsicles or stainless steel straws, and that should have been incorporated into your business valuation. That was a very difficult integration example, and that's why most people would have missed it. And if you did, it's not tragic. The second one, most people would have picked up on and was far more important. Required number 4, you were asked to deal with controls. In required number 5, you were asked to deal with procedures. The reason why they're intertwined is you were told that the substantive procedures should be predicated on the assumption that whatever internal control weaknesses you recommended in required 4 have been implemented before you do the procedures in required 5. So doing required 4 before 5 was absolutely critical. Is that clear to everybody? Because you got to first deal with internal controls, make your recommendations, and then assume they've been implemented for the purpose of coming up with procedures. So at the end of the day, the way that I'm going to take up this case is I'll take them up in the order in which a student should have attacked their requirements. Given that required 2, determining the profitability of the 2 product options, impacts required 1, determining what the business is worth, I'm going to take up required 2 before 1. I'm also going to take up required 4 before 5. So, as I mentioned before, we're going to take up all the requires except for the tax required, because I really can't add any value there. It's purely technical. If you don't know the answers, guys, in other words, if you had a hard time with this, read the solution carefully, and you also may want to go back to the tax material. So you'll probably want to read the solution, and you also may want to go back to your tax technical material. So let's start with required number 2. Since 2 impacts 1, I said I would take up the requires in the order in which a student would have done them. We'll do 2 before 1. Let's now take a look at required number 2. So what I did was I copied the required at the top of the page. I'm just going to read the bolded portion, which is a critical part of the required. Which one of the 2 products would be the more profitable option? I'm interested in profitability not only in the first year, but also on an ongoing basis, and then discuss any qualitative factors. So it was very important to pay attention to the fact that you're being asked to do quantitative and qualitative analysis. There is a good chance that there will be a separate AO for the quants versus the qualitative. So if you get too caught up in the quants and you pay insufficient attention to the qualitative, you could literally lose an AO. Also, you should have picked up on the fact that Kevin is interested in profitability, not only in the first year, but also on an ongoing basis. This was a clue that there will likely be one-time costs in year 1 that don't continue on an ongoing basis. So it's going to be very important to consider year one separately from future years. And you'll see when we get to the guide that that was quite essential for getting competent. And the trigger was that they told you explicitly that he's interested in profitability, not only in the first year, but also on an ongoing basis. That to me was a pretty strong hint that I need to look at the two separately. When doing numbers, remember the following from the numerical methods course. Guys, I don't know if anybody yet has watched the videos for numerical methods. If you've not watched, the numerical methods is offered asynchronously, okay? The videos already are available to you. If you haven't watched it yet, and I imagine many of you have not, please watch it sooner rather than later. It's a very, very important course in which we deal with number crunching on the CP. The whole course revolves around, or the whole numerical methods session revolves around dealing with numbers effectively on the CP. These ancillary points I discuss in depth in numerical methods. So I'm not going to go over them in depth right now, but I'm going to tell you that please watch the video and you'll see there will be more depth on this, plus lots and lots of other things. So please do make sure to watch those numerical methods videos. Okay, is that clear to everybody? Now, in the numerical methods course, I explained that ancillary points are qualitative points that revolve around the numbers. And it's very important that you address these ancillary points when you do quantitative analysis. The first ancillary point is explaining why you're doing the analysis. At the top of every exhibit, always state your purpose for doing the analysis. If you watch the numerical methods class, you'll see why that's important. Make assumptions in doing your calculations. And you may sometimes have to critique client assumptions, like in the ABBA case. Remember in the ABBA case, you had to critique client assumptions? Again, in the video on numerical methods, I talk a lot more about how much you need to show for your assumptions. So point number 2 is very important. I talk about when you need to show assumptions versus when you don't. I'm not going to get into that tonight because there isn't time, but it's discussed in depth in the video. Draw a conclusion. A conclusion is critical for getting competent. If you want to get competent on a number crunching AO, you must conclude. A conclusion in the context of number crunching is different from a recommendation. A conclusion is where you explain purely factually what the numbers tell us. You're simply describing what the numbers tell us. The conclusion always flows from the reason you did the analysis. So I will demonstrate this when we get to the number crunching. I'll demonstrate how the conclusion flows from the purpose in point number 1. But a conclusion is just a factual description of what the numbers tell us. I like to put my conclusion at the bottom of my exhibit, but if you put your conclusion in the main body of your answer in Word, that's also fine. I just prefer to put it at the bottom of my exhibit because if I think of every exhibit as having a purpose at the top, followed by numbers, followed by a conclusion at the bottom, I will never forget to conclude. If I put it in my Word document, sometimes I'll remember, sometimes I won't. A marker, though, doesn't care where you put it, but you only need to put it in one or the other. Point number 4, I'm not going to get into tonight because it's not so relevant for tonight's case. It's called the analysis point, where you explain why the numbers turned out the way they did. Please, when you watch the numerical methods video, I get into a fair amount of depth on this point, but again, it's not that relevant for tonight, so I'm not going to deal with it right now. And then finally, remember to obviously come to a recommendation. When you come to your recommendation, you're going to be tying back to the conclusion, obviously, how the numbers turned out, right? What the numbers tell us will obviously affect your recommendation. When the analysis point is relevant, and again, when you watch the numerical methods video, you'll understand when it's relevant. When it's relevant, you'll also be tying back to the analysis. And at the end of the day, when you make your recommendation, very important to tie back to both the quantitative and the qualitative analysis. This, again, is discussed in numerical methods. Another very important theme in numerical methods is not trying to do the numbers perfectly. If you try to hit every last number, you will waste a tremendous amount of time and you're not going to have time for your qualitative. So you want to leave out numbers that will only have a minor impact on the bottom line, particularly if they're going to be time consuming to compute. Usually the way the marking guide looks on the real CFE is on the real CFE, usually getting competent is simply a matter of hitting X number of adjustments. And they don't typically differentiate between difficult adjustments and easy adjustments. And you can often do a much larger number of easy adjustments in the same amount of time that it would take you to do one difficult adjustment. So if I can get 3 easy adjustments under my belt in the time that it would take me to do one difficult adjustment, it makes more sense to go after those 3 easy adjustments. If you have an adjustment that's going to have a huge impact on the bottom line, you have no choice but to deal with it, even if it's time consuming. But for the remainder of the adjustments, you want to go after the easy ones. This is something we discuss in depth in the numerical methods session. For the qualitative analysis, it's going to require a lot less time than the quants, but very critical. It'll be important to do qualitative analysis for each of the 2 options. To get competent, you know that you're going to need to make maximum use of case facts. Although many of the facts were given in Appendix 4, where they described the 2 options, be careful not to ignore the case facts in Appendix 1. Because at the end of the day, in Appendix 1, where they gave you, KBBT and industry information, some of that information was relevant for your qualitative analysis. Like, for example, you were told in Appendix 1 what's important to your customer base, being environmentally friendly. I'd probably want to take that into account when I come up with my recommendations. So at the end of the day, as long as you've done a good outline, hopefully you've captured whatever relevant information you needed, and you're going to capture information whether it's in the main exhibit or not. The main exhibit for this required was obviously Appendix 4, but hopefully you've captured information outside of Appendix 4 that's relevant. It'll be a lot easier to use case facts if you track them while you're doing your outline. So that's what I just said just now. Give pros and cons for each option. When you're considering options on a CP, there's a good chance the guide will be broken down based on pros and cons. Even if it's not, it's quite likely that you're going to need a balanced analysis to get competent. By balanced analysis, I mean pros and cons. So at the end of the day, if you don't have balance, very difficult to get competent. Let's take a look now at an example of RC versus C. Again, remember the responses I'm showing you were prepared by a CP marker, and hopefully you'll get a better understanding of what makes something competent versus reaching competence. As I mentioned earlier, most of the comments are also those of the CP marker. I added the odd point, but they're mainly those of the CP marker, and then the CP marker actually marked each of the AOs. Let's start off with the RC response. The RC candidate says, I calculated the profitability of stainless steel straws and the bubble tea popsicles in order to determine which one the company should adopt. Please see my quantitative analysis in Exhibit 1. So guys, always refer to your numerical exhibit from your main body of your answer in Word. So in the Word document, she points out over here, good to refer to the exhibit from the main body of your answer. The main body being in Word, of course. Let's now take a look at the student's numbers. Notice that the RC candidate does not provide a purpose. I said it's always a good idea to provide your purpose at the top of your exhibit. According to the CP marker, RC candidates frequently do not. Let's take a look now at the stainless steel straws option. Catherine says over here, reasonably calculates awarded, although work not shown, as number is correct. One of the things that I discuss in the numerical methods course is that as long as you get the number right, even if you don't show your work, you will always get reasonably calculated. So why should I show my work? If it's a more complex number cruncher, it's still a good idea to show your work, because if you make a careless mistake and you show your work, you may still be able to get reasonably calculated. But if you don't show your work and make a careless mistake, the marker probably won't be able to follow your work. So as long as you get the number right, you'll never be penalized for not showing your assumption, but it's still good to do so if it's a more complex calculation. If it's a really simple calculation, Catherine will tell you, don't bother to show your work because you're going to get the number right anyhow. Once you get the number right, showing your work buys you nothing. Is that clear to everybody? Now, let's continue. When it comes to the manufacturing fee, the candidate comes out with a $33,840. Let's look at Catherine's comment. She says, this is considered to be an attempt rather than reasonably calculate. Remember, you want to get reasonably calculate in order to get competent. Since it's missing the case fact of using 18 straws a day times the number of days they're open. They went to the trouble of telling you how many days they're open. They went to the trouble of telling you what the cost is and the number of straws that you would be able to get for that cost. So you have enough information to figure out the cost per straw. You have enough information to know how many straws are going to be used. Our candidate ignored a lot of this information and they oversimplified the calculation. All the students seem to do is take the monthly cost and multiply by 12. They pretty much ignored a lot of the information provided. If you ignore a ton of the information provided, unlikely you'll do the calculation at the level necessary to get reasonably calculate. So she only gave the student an attempt for the manufacturing fee. Later on, I'm going to show you the competent response, and you'll see how the competent student makes much better use of the numbers that were provided. Here, you're dealing with very simple numbers, the marketing and website setup fee, and there the candidate gets reasonably calculate because these numbers are fine, they're correct. When it comes to the total benefit or loss, look at what Catherine says. Reasonably calculate even though total benefit is not correct. As long as it's the total benefit or cost or loss is correct based on your own calculation, you're going to get reasonably calculate. So if you were to compare this to the practical solution, these numbers are not correct. But they are correct based on the student's own solution. Therefore, you get reasonably calculate. If you needed to come down to the perfect number here to get reasonably calculate, virtually nobody would. For the bubble tea, once again, the candidate gets reasonably calculate for the incremental revenue, even though no assumption is shown, because the number is correct. When it comes to the gross profit, do you remember what you're trying to do here? You're not simply trying to calculate incremental sales from bubble tea popsicles. You're really trying to determine incremental profit. So what the candidate should have done is added up these two numbers and then multiplied by the gross profit margin in order to capture the incremental gross profit. The candidate missed that. Is that clear to everybody? We're interested in incremental gross profit, not just incremental sales. When it comes to the additional salary, look at Catherine's comment. This is considered to be an attempt since the candidate forgets to deduct the salaries of Kevin and Mr. T, include it in salary before calculating the salary for an additional part-timer. Guys, if I want to know what an additional part-timer will cost, what I really should be doing is taking the total salaries of $180,900, backing out the salaries for Mr. T and for Kevin, as well as the tuition fees that were included in here. Now, once I back out these numbers, now I've got the total salaries for part-time workers. If you then take the total salary for part-time workers and you divide by 5, you're going to get a much lower number. The reason the candidate got such a ridiculously high number is because they simply took the total salaries, all they backed out was the $1,500 of tuition that should not have been sitting in salaries, and divided by 5. That makes no sense because we're only interested in an average part-timer salary. So we need to know total part-time salaries divided by number of part-time workers. One of the clues that should have made the student realize that something was wrong is if they were thinking, they would have said, something's got to be wrong here. An average part-timer, working in a shop is not going to be making $35,880. Is everybody with me? So they should have realized something must be wrong. Sometimes I think students almost work mechanically without thinking, and that's never a good idea. When it comes to the refrigerator and molds, that number is correct, so the student gets reasonably calculate, and then the total benefit or loss is also fine, so this candidate gets reasonably calculate. Once again, objectively, this is not a correct number, but it is correct based on the student's own numbers. No conclusion. Very frequently, weaker students, RC students, do not conclude. Concluding is critical for getting competent. Note the combination of reasonably calculated attempts. What Catherine is trying to demonstrate here is that even reaching competence candidates, they don't just get all attempts. They'll get some items at the reasonably calculate level, but unfortunately, they won't get enough items at the reasonably calculate level to get competent. Now I'm going back to the student's Word document. My calculation shows stainless steel straws will generate a loss of $14,167 in the first year and a profit of $11,084 onwards. Bubble tea popsicles will generate an income of $24,215 in the first year and 26,715 onwards. So take a look at Catherine's comments. Student wastes time describing the calculation in paragraphs here, but it adds no value as all of the numbers are straight from the exhibit and the marker has seen the exhibit. So it's unnecessary to simply repeat the same calculation. You're better off saving time for other AOs. But look at the clincher here. This is coming from the CP marker. What is, however, important and yet missing is a meaningful conclusion. It's not in the exhibit or the Word document. The conclusion, as I mentioned earlier, when we went through the 5 ancillary points, the conclusion always flows from the purpose for doing the numbers. The purpose for doing the numbers was to determine which is more profitable, the stainless steel straws or the bubble tea popsicles. Yet the student never concludes on which one is more profitable. If you now go back to the student numbers, had the student stated a purpose, they would have known what to conclude on. The purpose they should have stated was, the purpose of the calculation is to determine whether stainless steel straws or bubble tea popsicles are more profitable. That would have been their purpose. If I know that that's my purpose, then I know I need to conclude which is more profitable. Everybody with me? So had the student realized the purpose, what they would have done is they would have looked at these numbers versus these numbers. And they simply would have said, you know what? These numbers are much better than these numbers. Therefore, they would have said explicitly, they would have concluded explicitly that bubble tea popsicles are more profitable, because obviously this shows greater profitability than this. So just repeating the numbers doesn't help, but telling the client what this means, what the numbers mean, that does help. You know what the numbers mean? It's more profitable to produce bubble tea popsicles. How do I know I need to conclude on profitability? Because that was my purpose of doing the exhibit. So that's why I always emphasize stating your purpose for every exhibit. Because if you know your purpose, you know what to conclude on. Let's now look at the guide. If you look at the guide, the first part dealt with quantitative element straws. Partial if 5 attempted or 4 reasonably calculated. Yes if 5 reasonably calculated. The candidate is close to getting a yes, but only gets 4 R's, 4 reasonably calculates, because they did a very poor job on the manufacturing fee. So the manufacturing fee is sitting in attempt, so they don't have 5 at the reasonably calculate level. Same thing is true when it comes to the popsicles. You needed 5 at the reasonably calculate level in order to get competent. Once again, the candidate is close to getting a yes, but only gets 4 R's because the additional salary, they did a very poor job on, the additional part-time salary, and therefore they only got attempt. So at the end of the day, they did well enough to get a partial, because a partial is 5 attempted or 4 reasonably calculated, and the same is true for the popsicles. So they did enough to get a partial, but not enough to get a yes. Generally, you're going to need to get a yes in order to get competent. When it comes to the conclusion, provides a supported conclusion on whether to produce straws or popsicles consistent with quantitative analysis, our candidate only got a partial. The reason why our candidate only got a partial is they didn't have a meaningful conclusion, right? All they did in conclusion was repeat what the exhibit, what the client could see in the exhibit, rather than telling the client what this means. Point number 4 is very minor. Most students missed it. I'm not going to focus on it. It wasn't even critical for getting competent. So what did you need to do to get RC? And I always focus on what's in the brackets, because I don't think anybody cares about the verbiage before the brackets. It's kind of unimportant. So let's focus on what's in the brackets. Our student ended up getting RC because they only had a partial on quantitative elements, and they only had a partial on quantitative elements. For RC, partial was good enough. And also for RC, you didn't need a conclusion. We'll see later on, when we look at the competent response, this obviously isn't good enough for competent. Let's now take a look at the competent response. In the competent response, the candidate begins, I've calculated the profitability of the stainless steel straws. Basically, I'm not going to read this to you. It's exactly the same as the RC candidate. What the candidate is doing is referring to their quants from their Word document. Once again, Catherine says that's a good thing to do. Now let's look at the actual number crunching of the stronger student, the competent student. So notice the competent student has a purpose to determine whether it's more profitable to produce straws or popsicles. You don't need to write a lot for that purpose. One line is generally sufficient. For the stainless steel straws, I just want to make a few comments. Notice, guys, that when it came to calculating the manufacturing fee, take a look at how the competent student did it. The competent student took into account that there are 523 straws. I'm sorry, that for 2020, you get 520 straws. So they figured out a cost per straw of $5.42. They took into account how many days the store is open and how many straws will be used each day. And now they're able to come up with a good number. So this, can you see, isn't this a lot better than simply taking 2020 times 12? If they gave you all this information and you're ignoring it, if you're ignoring a ton of quants, something is wrong. Now, look at Catherine's comment. Good that students provide support for complicated calculations, not necessary for less complicated calculations. This is the point that I made earlier. As long as you get the number right, if you don't show any support, you'll still get reasonably calculated. So it's not worth showing your work for a simple calculation. But for something like this, it's very possible to make a careless mistake. So here, by showing your work, even if the candidate had made a slight minor error, they still would have ended up getting reasonably calculated. Even if this number hadn't been perfect, if it was just due to a minor error and the candidate explained what they were doing, they still would have been fine. Note the difference, guys, right? Much better use of case facts than the RC candidate. Let's move on. The next comment Catherine made was Catherine said, note that if a student makes one mistake and it impacts other numbers, she would only be penalized once. So let's say steel straw sales had been miscalculated. The student would have still been awarded reasonably for calculating a 2% fee, even though the wrong sales number is used. Let me explain what I mean by that. Let's say instead of coming up with 44,923 here, you would come up with 40,000. If you then took 2% of 40,000 instead of 2% of the correct number, and instead of getting 898, you got 800, you would still get reasonably calculated here. They'll only punish you once for the same mistake. So if I miscalculated this number, but then I took 2% of what I thought was the correct number, I will still get reasonably calculated. They're not going to punish me twice for miscalculating this number. Is that clear to everybody? For the bubble tea popsicles, Catherine comments that this is very good support. The candidate got the number right anyhow, so had they not provided support, they still would have got reasonably calculate, but they didn't know in advance that they weren't going to make a mistake. So it was a good idea to show their work. This is another comment of Catherine's. Similar to our C response, student forgot to calculate gross profit on the additional sales based on 85% gross profit. Do you remember I said earlier, we're interested in incremental profits. So one should have added up these two numbers and multiplied by the profit margin. Same way the RC candidate missed that, so did the competent student. And look at Catherine's comment here. Missed that point on guide, even C student is not perfect. She's trying to demonstrate that even a competent student will sometimes miss something that looks fairly significant. Competent is not a synonym for perfect. You can be far from perfect and still be competent. Even competent with distinction isn't perfect. Is that clear? When it comes to the additional salary for the part-time workers, this is a much better calculation. The competent student takes the total salaries, backs out Mr. T's salary and Kevin's salary, and now divides by 5 part-timers. That's why they end up with a number that's far more reasonable. If you look at Catherine's comment here, minor error, a student forgot to deduct the $1,500 for the college course. That should have been deducted also, but still achieves reasonably calculates. The error was much less significant than in the RC response. Forgetting to back out huge chunks of salary paid to Kevin and Mr. T, that's really significant. Just not backing out that small $1,500 for tuition, that's a minor error. You can make a minor error and still achieve reasonably calculate. Is that clear to everybody? Finally, the conclusion. Notice the competent student comes to a conclusion. The reason we did this calculation was to figure out which one is more profitable. And our candidate addresses that in the conclusion. The bubble tea popsicle option outperformed the stainless steel straws in both the first year and onward. That's the same thing as saying the bubble tea option was more profitable in the first year and onward, right? The candidate recognizes these numbers are higher than these numbers, and they concluded appropriately. The fact they didn't use the word profitable doesn't matter. They got the point across. We've already read we already saw this before we looked at the numbers. Now let's take a look at this. I'd like you to read just the first two sentences up to where my cursor is. Just read the first two sentences up to where my cursor is, which is right here. What Catherine says is, she says, no need to repeat what's in the exhibit, the profits from each option. So she's saying what you wrote in the first two sentences is a waste of time. Then let's see what the student said in the next two sentences. Purely from a quantitative standpoint, the bubble tea popsicle option has outperformed stainless steel straws and would be the better choice in the long run. However, you should review the qualitative factors to support your decision. So even though this is a good conclusion, look at her comment here. No need to conclude in Excel and Word. If you've already concluded here at the bottom of your exhibit, don't repeat the same conclusion again. You won't be penalized for it, but you're wasting your time. Let's now look at the guide. Notice that the competent student has more R's than necessary. You needed 5 reasonably calculates, 5 R's to get a yes. Our competent student has more than 5, and that's for the straws. When it comes to the popsicles, they have exactly 5. So they have a yes on both. Our competent student had an excellent conclusion. There was no need to do it twice, but they had an excellent conclusion. Even our competent student missed point number 4, but it was not critical for getting competent. So at the end of the day, what did you need to do to be competent? And again, I'm only going to look at what's in the brackets because the verbiage is before the brackets. Who cares? Yes on quantitative elements straws. Our candidate got a yes. Yes on quantitative elements popsicles. So our candidate got a yes on 1 and 2. And then finally, yes on conclusion. It always pains me when somebody does a good job on the numbers and they don't conclude. So even though they did a great job on the numbers, by missing that ancillary point conclusion, that's enough to push you down to RC. So please, it should become it should be almost instinctive, not almost, it should be instinctive by the time you get to the CP to always conclude. Let's now take a look at the qualitative portion of required number 2. So the first comment that Catherine makes for the RC response is good to break down pros and cons. So that she's happy the candidate did this. However, the problem is lack of implications. The candidate did not give implications. You remember when we did case writing techniques? The implication is the why. Why does this matter? And implications are absolutely critical. Remember when we did case writing techniques, I said one of the major factors that differentiates between RC and C is the competent student always gives the implication. So let's take a look at the response. I've compared the benefits and disadvantages from the qualitative factors, both stainless steel straws and bubble tea popsicles. So look at the first point. KBBT offers the steel straws both in-store and online. So look at Catherine's comment. You've only listed out the case facts here. You need to give the implication, meaning you need to describe how this will impact the business. So it's not hard to hit the implication point. It's just common sense. The student should have said that it might impact customer satisfaction, which will probably impact revenues. The implication is obvious. You just need to state it. I'll show you when we see the competent response, the competent candidate always gives the implication, and it doesn't take a lot of time. We hope that you enjoyed watching the excerpt from our case writing take-up. If you'd like to see the remainder of the take-up, as well as many other case writing sessions, as well as technical sessions that PASS offers as part of the course for Indian and other international CAs, we strongly recommend that you register for this course. If you're not already on our website, in order to register for the course, please go to our website, passyourcpa.ca, then simply click on the box that says Indian/Pakistani CAs. At the top of the screen, you'll see PASS courses. Simply put your cursor over PASS courses, There'll be a drop-down menu, then just click on CV Indian and other international CAs, and then scroll down in order to register for the course. If you have any questions relating to the PASS course, as well as any other questions relating to just getting your Canadian CPA, both Ira and myself would be delighted to speak with you. We've provided our contact information on this slide. We very much look forward to seeing you in the PASS course.